Look at me, Myra. Don't look at the leg. You're safe, little star. Keep going.
What if it breaks?
That's it! Let the leg follow you.
I'm running! Mama, I'm really running.
I see you, Myra. I see you.
It works! You fixed me!
No, Myra.
No, Myra! You did the hard part! Tell me you planned a way out!
I planned 3.
I noticed Myra before I noticed her mother. I have thought about that since. What it says about me. Or about the resettlement yard at Station Orvith in those first weeks of winter quarter, when the light came through the observation panels at an angle so flat and low that everything standing still seemed to belong to the walls. What the light made visible was movement, most mornings. What moved was children. The yard was the only open space on the residential tier large enough to matter, and the children used it the way children use any space they are given, completely, without asking. At speeds that made the adults near the railing quietly uneasy. They ran circuits along the perimeter, wide-legged and careless, in the way of people who have not yet learned that carelessness is something you eventually have to surrender. They played games that looked invented on the spot, but if you watched long enough, you saw the rules. Elaborate ones, enforced on each other with the specific mercilessness of small people who have decided that rules exist for a reason and that not following them is a kind of personal insult. The noise they made was different from adult noise, lighter, more continuous. Without the particular weight you hear in adult voices when people know exactly what they have lost. Myra did not run. She was 7 years old, or near enough to it. The resettlement records listed her age as approximate, which was common for the Vela collapse survivors. The record-keeping had been among the first things to fail, as it tends to be. She had the pale lavender skin that marked the Vela high bloodline. Very large dark eyes that seemed to take up more of her face than eyes usually do, and close-cropped silver-black hair that most of the Vela children kept the same way. She was small for her age in the manner that children who have come through a hard period sometimes are. Not fragile. Exactly. Compact was the better word. Economical with her movements. As if she had learned at some point, she could not quite remember that taking up less space was the most reasonable response to a world that gave you limited options. She stood at the railing most mornings and watched the other children run. Her left leg below the knee was the standard-issue compact resettlement prosthetic, Model 7. Pediatric configuration. I knew the Model 7 well. 12 years in compact mobility engineering gives you a working relationship with every device in the standard catalog. And the Model 7 was a reliable piece of equipment. Properly built for the population the designers had in mind when they drew up the specifications. Adequate range of motion. Durable composite shell. 3 standard socket sizes covering approximately 70% of the pediatric residual limb geometries found in the compact's primary service populations. The other 30% was where the problems lived. The Velthra limb taper ratio was different from the compact standard. Slightly longer below the knee relative to total lower leg length, with a narrower distal taper, a geometry that showed up in multiple Vela family lineages, and was not remarkable within their own population, but sat outside the range the Model 7 socket designers had accounted for, on Myra's residual limb, which I could observe clearly from where I stood each morning. The standard pediatric socket was sitting approximately 8 millimeters too wide at the distal end. 8 millimeters doesn't sound like much. On a device whose entire function depends on precise contact geometry, it is not a small number. The gap created a pressure differential at the proximal rim during loaded movement. At slow walking speeds on flat surfaces, the differential was manageable. Uncomfortable in the way that a shoe too large for your foot is uncomfortable, but you can walk in it. You adjust. You compensate without thinking about it because your body is very good at compensating without telling you. At anything faster, the dynamics shifted. When load came on at push-off, the limb moved inside the socket. The socket's proximal rim caught the tissue at the wrong point, concentrating force where it had no business concentrating rather than spreading it across the full bearing surface the way a correctly fitted device is supposed to, at running speeds, where the load magnitudes were higher and the force arrived faster. That concentration was not merely uncomfortable, it was destabilizing in a way the body could not compensate its way out of. On a child who walked to meals and back to her quarters, 8 millimeters was livable. On a child who wanted to run circuits with 30 or 40 other children in the only open yard on the residential tier, 8 millimeters was the entire reason she was standing at the railing instead. I knew this because I had watched her try. It was on the third morning. She had not gone directly to the railing. She had come through the far corridor and walked out into the open space itself, where the other children were already running their morning circuits. She had started toward the main group, taken 4 running steps, and stopped. She stood there for a moment in the middle of the yard with a quality of stillness that I recognized. The specific stillness of a child working through a calculation, weighing whether to try again or to accept that this is not a thing that is going to work today, and that pushing it further will only make the failure more visible. Then she walked back to the railing, not quickly. The slow, deliberate walk of someone who has decided not to let anyone see that they are walking slowly on purpose. 4 running steps. From where I was standing, I could follow exactly what had happened in those 4 steps. The socket had slipped at the proximal rim on the second step, when the weight transferred to push-off. The slip sent a compensatory movement up through the gate pattern, an instinctive redistribution of load away from the point of discomfort, which is what bodies do when they do not want to tell you what is wrong. The compensation produced the halting, uneven pattern that she had felt in her body and registered without needing anyone to explain it, and that she had understood meant that moving through this yard with that gait pattern, while the other children ran freely and without any pattern at all, was not something she was going to do. She had made a decision. A 7-year-old had looked at the situation with the equipment she had available and made a correct decision about what was worth attempting and what was not, and she had acted on it. I went back to Workshop Bay 4 that afternoon and sat in front of the fabrication log and thought about the Velthera taper ratio for a while. I had been watching the yard for 11 days, not as part of my job. My formal remit at Orvith was to maintain the workshop equipment on the prosthetics fabrication level, support the fitting clinic with adjustments and repairs that fell within the standard authorization parameters, and assist the fabrication team with any custom work that had been approved through the modification request process. The modification request process for a custom pediatric socket outside the standard Model 7 range required sign-off from the assigned caseworker, the presiding medical officer, the station administrator, and the procurement coordinator. Average processing time, once all 4 signatures were in place, was 6 to 8 weeks. The authorized result, once that process ran its course, was one of 3 standard Model 7 socket variants. The wide base variant extended the proximal rim to redistribute pressure over a larger area, which helped with rim concentration but did not touch the distal geometry. The distal reinforced variant added stiffness at the distal cup to improve load transfer, which also did not touch the distal gap. The compliant liner variant used a softer liner formulation to reduce discomfort, which also did not touch the distal gap and additionally reduced the proprioceptive feedback that proper gait depends on. None of the 3 addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the socket was 8 millimeters too wide at the distal end, and there was no variant in the catalog that changed that dimension. The only thing that could fix Myra's fit was a socket built to her specific geometry. Saren Vella had refused all 3 standard variants. The refusal appeared twice in the case file with no documented reason. The assigned caseworker's notes marked it non-compliant and moved to the next action item. I had been a civilian volunteer at Orvith for 3 months. I had come because the station put out a critical shortage notice for precision fabrication skills, and precision fabrication was what I knew how to do. I had been doing it for 12 years, at 2 specialist postings before Orvith, one of which had been a collapse event posting with a substantial volume of pediatric prosthetics work in the months following the acute phase. I understood what the Model 7 was designed to accomplish and what it was not. I had been looking at Ra's socket from the railing for 11 days before I made any decision at all about what I intended to do about it. I noticed Saren on the second morning, or rather I noticed her in the way you notice something the second time, with the recognition that it was there the first time and you did not register it properly. She stood at the far end of the railing, separated from the other adults who came out to watch the yard, and she was still in a way that set her apart from the stillness of everyone around her. The people near her were still the way adults are still when watching children, loosely with their attention distributed, present with one part of themselves and somewhere else with the rest. Saren's stillness was not like that. It was controlled. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement but its active suppression. The kind built by months of practice in situations that gave you no other choice. She was tall for a Vela woman, taller than average for the bloodline. Blue-gray skin that the bloodline records associated with the senior administrative families. Dark amber eyes. The same close-cropped hair most of the Vela adults kept. She stood with her weight distributed evenly, both hands resting on the rail, and she watched Myra the way a person watches something they cannot change, with complete attention and almost no expression. Because expression is something you stop wasting when you are watching something you cannot change. She walked on her own legs. The Vela collapse had taken other things from her. The records were fragmentary in the way all collapse event records are, but they included a notation. Senior Bloodline Administrative Officer, Station Authority Grade 4, and then the word displaced, and then a processing timestamp 4 months old. I did not know what Grade 4 meant specifically in the Vela station hierarchy. It was not a designation I had worked with before, and I had not asked anyone to explain it. What I understood, from the postings I had worked before Orvith, was that the weight of a notation like that is never in the words. The words are a summary. What they are a summary of is considerably larger, a specific kind of position and responsibility and capacity that existed in a specific context, and that ended when the context did. She was standing at the railing of a resettlement yard, watching her daughter stand at the railing of a resettlement yard. And the Grade 4 notation was all that remained in the public record of everything that did not fit into 2 words. I was not her assigned caseworker. I was not a medical officer or a resettlement administrator. I had no formal standing with Sarin Vela or with Myra beyond my role in the fabrication-level support staff, which only touched the clinic when the clinic specifically requested it. The modification request process had not requested it. The standard variance had been offered and declined, and the case was sitting flagged as non-compliant, and that was where it stood. I had been looking at that file, and at the railing, for 11 days before I did anything. What I did first was not speak to Sarin. That came the following morning. What happened first was that Myra walked past me. It was the 4th morning. She came out from the far corridor, moving in the compact, deliberate way she moved. Not hurrying, not slow, occupying exactly as much space as necessary and no more. She was going to pass me and continue to her position at the railing, and I was going to say nothing. The same as I had said nothing for the 3 mornings before it, because I had not made a decision yet. She stopped. She turned and looked at me. The large dark eyes had none of her mother's controlled quality. They were simply direct. The directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are not supposed to be asked out loud. "You were watching my socket," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "Can you fix it?" "I think so. I would need to take some measurements first." "When?" "That would be up to your mother." She looked at the yard, where the circuit runners were already moving. And then she looked back at me with the same steady, unhurried attention. "I will ask her," she said, and walked to the railing. I introduced myself to Sarin the following morning. Myra had taken her usual position at the far end, and I walked down to where Sarin stood with her hands on the rail and her attention on her daughter. I gave her my name and my credential, and told her directly that I had been observing Myra's gait pattern from the railing for the past 4 mornings. I said this plainly because there was no better way to say it. I told her what I had observed about the socket geometry, explained the 8mm distal gap and what it was doing to the load transfer pathway at running speeds, and told her what a correctly fitted socket would do differently. I told her it would require 3 measurement sessions of approximately 30 minutes each. After that, I would fabricate the corrected socket in my own time in Workshop Bay 4, and she would not need to be present again until the fitting. I told her the process would not run through the standard modification authorization procedure, and that she had no obligation to agree. She listened to all of this without any change in her expression. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, her attention still on Myra. 2 weeks, she said. Approximately. Yes, why not the standard timeline? She did not say it as a question. Because the standard timeline produces one of the 3 variants, and none of the 3 variants fix the problem. Another silence. Then, why are you doing this? Not the timeline. I understood the timeline. Why? Because I can, I said, and because she should be running. She looked at me then. For the first time since I had walked over, the amber eyes were on me directly. They had something working behind them, quiet and methodical. The look of someone who has learned to be careful about what they let in and is taking the time to make that determination properly. "She asked you," Sarin said. "Yes." A pause. Something in her expression shifted by a fraction, not softening. Exactly. More like a recalibration towards something she had already half decided. "First session, tomorrow," she said. 7th hour. She turned back to the yard. I walked back toward Workshop Bay 4 and added the first entry to what would become a fabrication log. Behind me, at the railing, Myra was watching the circuit runners with the careful attention she brought to everything. Her hands rested on the rail in exactly the same position her mother's hands rested, side by side, both of them facing the same direction. And the morning went on around them the way mornings do. I wrote down the 7th hour and began laying out the measurement sequence. The first session. I set up the measurement station in Workshop Bay 4 before the 7th hour. I brought in a second stool from the corridor storage and positioned it across the workbench from the main fabrication seat. Because the session would have 3 people in it, and the bay was not large, but it was workable if you arranged it deliberately. I laid out the equipment in the order I would need it. Flexible tape, goniometric attachment, circumferential tape, tissue compliance probe, marker template, nothing unusual. The same sequence I had run 23 times before, though never in a bay this small or at this hour or with quite this particular quality of anticipation. They arrived together, Myra a half step ahead, which I would come to understand was her usual position relative to her mother in any new space. She went directly to the fitting bench and looked at the equipment laid out on it the way she looked at most things, with complete attention and no performance of interest, just the actual thing itself, exactly as it was. Saren came in behind her, took in the bay in a single unhurried sweep, and sat on the second stool without being directed to it. I began with the standard limb assessment sequence, residual length first, measured from the knee joint center to the distal end of the residual limb. I used a flexible tape and recorded the measurement to 2 decimal places in centimeters. Circumference at 4 levels, proximal, mid-length, mid-distal, and distal, each taken with the limb in both unloaded and lightly loaded position. Because the tissue compression behavior under load is relevant to socket design in ways that the unloaded measurement alone does not tell you. Distal taper angle. Using the goniometric attachment on the measurement stand. This was the critical measurement, the one that would define the socket's primary geometry. And I took it 3 times and averaged the results before recording it. Tissue compliance assessment, which involved careful manual palpation at the primary bearing zones to understand how the tissue responded to pressure at each specific location. This told me where the socket wall needed to be accommodating and where it could be firm. Socket bearing zone mapping, done with the marker template and transferred to the design diagram. I made notes as I worked and described each step as I did it, in precise terms, because that seemed to be what the room required. Myra watched each step with the same complete attention she had directed at the equipment when she first walked in. Saren watched from the second stool and said nothing. At the end of the sequence, Myra said, "How does the socket work?" So I explained it. The suspension liner, which fit over the residual limb and created the primary interface between skin and socket. A silicone layer that distributed pressure across the contact surface and provided enough friction to prevent the liner from shifting during activity. The socket wall, the rigid structural element responsible for transferring force between the liner and the external prosthetic components. Its geometry needed to match the residual limb's geometry precisely, so that load was distributed correctly across the entire bearing surface, rather than finding the path of least resistance and concentrating there. The distal cup, which supported the end of the residual limb and prevented pistoning. The specific movement of the limb shifting forward inside the socket test that she had been experiencing at push-off. The load transfer pathway. The sequence by which the force generated during walking and running was converted into forward motion through the pylon to the foot unit. I explained why the standard socket was wrong for her geometry. The distal width 8 mm too large meant that when load was applied, her limb sat lower in the socket than the design intended, which shifted the proximal rim contact point and concentrated pressure at the rim edge rather than distributing it across the bearing surface. At walking speeds, that concentration was uncomfortable. At running speeds, where force magnitudes were higher and the rate of application was faster, it produced the instability she had experienced. The slip at push-off, the compensatory weight shift, the 4 steps, and the decision to stop. I explained what the corrected socket would do differently, built to her specific taper ratio, with the distal cup positioned to match her exact geometry. Her limb would sit correctly under all load conditions. The proximal rim would contact the right tissue zone. The pressure would distribute evenly across the full bearing surface the way it was supposed to. It would feel, in the most functional sense, like it was where it belonged. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "What is tissue compliance?" I explained that too. the way different tissues respond differently to applied load, how the tissue in the primary bearing zone just below the knee has a different compression characteristic than the tissue at the distal end, how the socket has to account for that difference at every point along the bearing surface, because an even wall geometry applied to uneven tissue produces uneven pressure, and uneven pressure produces discomfort and, over time, damage. How I had mapped her specific compliance zones during the assessment and would build that information into the socket geometry at the design stage, so that the wall was shaped not just to her external measurements, but to the behavior of the tissue underneath them. Sarin had not said anything through the measurement sequence or the explanation. When they were leaving, she paused at the door of the bay. She did not turn around. "She understands more than she lets on," Sarin said. "She always has." Then she was gone, and Myra followed, and I sat with my notes and the fabrication log and the sense that the room was quieter than it had been before they arrived. The second session was 3 days later. The atmosphere was different in a way that was not easy to name, not warmer, less measuring, perhaps, as if a threshold had been crossed in the first session that did not need to be recrossed. Sarin had spent the 3 days between sessions working through what I had told her and identifying, with the methodical precision of someone who does not leave gaps standing if she can close them, exactly what she had not yet understood. The questions she brought were specific. They were sequenced. They addressed the mechanical failure modes of the standard socket in exactly the order a person would reach them if they had been living with those failures on their daughter's behalf for 4 months and had been thinking about little else in between. She asked about the load transfer pathway in detail, how the force generated at push-off traveled from the foot unit through the pylon to the socket wall, and what happened to that distribution when the socket geometry was wrong. I walked her through it. Under a correct walking gait, force arrives at the socket wall distributed across the distal and mid-sock bearing zones. When the socket fits correctly, the wall geometry channels that force efficiently through the tissue to the skeletal structure of the residual limb. When the socket sits too wide at the distal end, the limb rides low. The force concentrates at the proximal rim, the first contact point the socket finds. Rather than spreading across the surface it was designed to use, at walking loads, uncomfortable, at running loads, destabilizing. She asked about the suspension liner's behavior under repeated flexion, whether the material would hold its geometry over 18 months of regular use or soften and degrade with activity. I told her the liner specification I was using had been validated for a minimum of 18 months of normal pediatric activity before showing clinically significant compliance changes, and that the weekly inspection routine she would conduct at the proximal rim would catch early wear signs before they affected fit quality. I showed her what to look for. Surface texture changes at the rim contact zone, compression set in the liner wall at the primary bearing areas, discoloration or fine cracking in the silicone matrix. I showed her where each of these indicators appeared and what they looked like at early, middle, and late stages of wear, because I wanted her to be able to read them herself rather than depend on someone else to tell her what she was seeing. She asked about the 3 standard Model 7 variants. I described each one fully. The wide base variant extended the proximal rim to redistribute pressure over a larger surface area, which helped with rim concentration but did not change the distal dimension. The distal reinforced variant added stiffness at the distal cup to improve load transfer at that zone, which also did not change the distal dimension. The compliant liner variant used a softer liner formulation to reduce discomfort at the cost of reduced proprioceptive feedback, which affected gait quality, and also did not change the distal dimension. None of the 3 addressed the geometry mismatch. What they addressed was how the socket failed, and they changed that in ways that might make the failure somewhat less noticeable. They did not make the socket fit. "You read the case notes," she said. "The refusal records were in the public file. You declined twice without documented reason." A pause. When someone refuses twice without explanation, they generally understand exactly what they are refusing. She was quiet for a moment, then she nodded once and moved on. I showed her the fabrication log, the measurement data from the first session, the preliminary geometry sketches, the material specifications for the composite shell. I showed her exactly where Myra's measurements diverged from the Model 7 design parameters at each level, and I walked her through the geometry sketch that showed how the 8 mm distal width discrepancy compounded through the load pathway to produce the behavior she had been watching for 4 months. She studied the sketch for a long time. I could see her working through it on her own, following the load pathway herself, checking the failure mode against the geometry without being guided to it. The distal width, she said. She indicated the line on the sketch. Yes, if that measurement were corrected, the proximal rim contact would be in the right zone. And from the right zone, the load at push-off distributes across the full bearing surface. Correct. She set the sketch down. She asked about material cost. I told her I was drawing from Workshop Bay 4's general supply allocation. The general supply allocation, she said. That means you are absorbing the cost yourself. She had understood the accounting structure faster than I would have expected from someone unfamiliar with how aid station workshops operated, which, I reminded myself, I should have expected. A Grade 4 station authority notation is not a clerical designation. The material cost is not significant, I said. She was quiet. The amber eyes held something that the controlled surface almost, but not entirely, contained. It is to me, she said. I did not say anything to that. We went back to the technical specifications. Myra, who had been listening to the entire conversation from the fabrication stool without any visible sign of restlessness, asked what composite shell meant. I explained it. Fiber-reinforced polymer matrix. Fibers oriented to provide stiffness in the load-bearing direction while allowing controlled flexibility in the secondary directions. Bonded in a resin system that determined the surface hardness and the impact resistance of the finished shell. For the corrected socket, I was using a slightly modified fiber orientation in the distal section to give better load distribution precisely where her geometry diverged most from the standard. The adjustment was not large. The effect on the load pathway was. The surface tinting was separate, I added, a cosmetic agent applied after the cure cycle was complete. No structural function whatsoever. What color? Myra said. I had not decided yet. She looked at her mother, then looked back at me. Blue-gray, she said. Like her. I made a note in the fabrication log. I did not say anything else about it. The third session was a week after the first, verification measurements only. Final geometry confirmation before committing to the layup sequence. Myra sat on the fabrication stool and held still with the practiced patience of someone who had done this twice already and genuinely understood why the stillness mattered, which is a different kind of stillness than the kind you produce in a child by telling them to sit still. Saren sat across from her with the same focused attention she had brought to both previous sessions. Though she asked fewer questions this time, she had, I thought, been asking questions for 3 days between sessions and had arrived at the third one with most of her questions answered. I worked through the measurement sequence again, the same positions as the first session, checking for any shift in the tissue compliance pattern, which can change between assessment sessions in ways that require design adjustments. Children's tissue compliance is more variable than adults because they grow, and because their activity levels are less consistent, and because residual limb tissue is still stabilizing in the months following injury. I had taken Myra's initial measurements 10 days before this session. I needed to confirm that nothing meaningful had shifted before I committed the geometry to the layup. Nothing had. The tissue compliance map was stable across all 4 measurement levels. The distal taper angle was within 0.2 of a degree of the first session reading, which fell inside the acceptable variance for the fabrication process I was using. I recorded the final numbers, wrote the geometry confirmation in the log, and closed it. Saren said, "What happens if the geometry comes out wrong?" I adjust the layup parameters and start the affected section again. How often does that happen? On a custom pediatric socket? Twice, I said. In 23 fittings over 12 years. She looked at me steadily. 23 where? 2 specialist postings before Orvith and Dor for 8 months. Something shifted in the amber eyes when I said the name. Veldoran had collapsed 14 months before Vela. Every displaced person from the Vela collapse had been watching the Veldoran aftermath from wherever they found themselves at the time, with the attention of people who understood they were looking at their own future, arriving on a different trajectory. The aftermath, she said, month 2 through month 10. After the acute phase settled, pediatric prosthetics was one of several significant needs. The collapse mechanism was different from Vela. More structural failure at the station level, a different injury pattern overall. But pediatric work was part of it. She was quiet for a moment. "You know what a collapse is," she said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a calculation completing. "I know what the aftermath looks like," I said. "Some of it." She straightened the cuff of her sleeve and stood. 4 days, she said, and walked out. Myra paused at the door and looked at me with the large, steady eyes. She likes you, Myra said. She does not know me, I said. That is different from not liking you, Myra said, and followed her mother. I stayed with that for a while. The way you stay with something that does not resolve on its own, but is not uncomfortable to sit with. Then I went to the layup station, opened the fabrication log to a new page, and wrote the date and the confirmation that all geometry parameters were finalized within tolerance. Outside the bay, the station's residential tier had gone quiet, in the way it went quiet every afternoon when the children came inside, and the corridors belonged to the adults for a few hours. The observation panels above the yard were dark at this angle, the winter quarter light already dropping below the panel line. Somewhere on the residential tier, a door closed. Somewhere further, something mechanical cycled through its routine. The sounds of a station in the middle of its day, ordinary and continuous and not requiring any attention. I noted the start time in the log. I laid out the materials in the order I would need them, and I began. The socket shell took 9 days. I had told Saren 4, and then I had messaged her on the 3rd day to say it would be 6, because the composite formulation I had chosen for the distal pressure optimization used a different resin ratio from the standard mix, and the different ratio extended the cure time between layers. She replied. What is the impact on the final geometry? I replied. None, she replied. Understood. 2 words. The most efficient confirmation I had received in 3 months at Orvith, and I found that I was not surprised by it. The fabrication happened in the evenings, in the hours after my regular workshop duties ended at the 7th hour. Workshop Bay 4 was empty in the evenings except for me and the bench lamp, and whatever was currently curing in the fixture. The station's residential tier wound down toward its overnight cycle outside the bay door. I could hear it sometimes. The corridor sounds changing as the afternoon activity gave way to the quieter patterns of evening, meals and returns and the occasional voice. But inside the bay, the only sounds were the equipment and the work. I did not mind working at that hour. Precision fabrication is not the kind of work that changes with the time of day. It requires the same things at the 7th hour as at the 2nd. Attention, patience with the material, and the willingness to redo a section that is wrong rather than accept one that is only mostly right. The hour is irrelevant. What matters is whether you are still capable of seeing clearly, and I was. I started with the distal cup. This was the most geometrically critical element of the entire assembly. The cup needed to match Myra's specific distal taper angle precisely, within the tolerance range I had calculated from the assessment data, in order for the socket to sit correctly on the residual limb under load. If the cup was wrong, everything built on top of it would be wrong in ways that compounded. I built it up in 3 laminate layers, checking the geometry after each layer against the assessment template before proceeding to the next. The first layer came out correctly. I checked it at 6 measurement points around the circumference, and all 6 were within tolerance. The second layer had a problem. Barely visible, a slight asymmetry on the medial wall. Approximately 1.5 millimeters of variation across a 12 centimeter span. In isolation, 1.5 millimeters is not much. In the context of a socket whose function depends on geometry, 1.5 millimeters is a problem that compounds through the remaining layers and arrives at the finished shell as a misfit that will cause exactly the kind of pressure differential I was building this socket specifically to eliminate. I looked at it under the bench lamp for a while, rotating the cup slowly, confirming that what I was seeing was there and not an artifact of the light or the hour. It was there. I ground the layer back to the first layer and laid it again. The relayed second layer was within tolerance at all 6 measurement points. I noted the redo in the fabrication log without characterizing it as a failure, because it was not a failure. It was a first attempt that produced a result outside acceptable parameters, and a second attempt that produced a result inside them. The cup, when the third layer was complete and cured, was what I had designed it to be. The socket wall came next, built up in 4 sections over the following 2 evenings. Each section was a layer of fiber laid in the calculated orientation over the previous layer, wet with the resin system, and placed in the curing fixture to set. The resin ratio I had chosen for the distal section extended the cure time from the standard 4 hours to approximately 6. This was predictable from the material specifications. It did not concern me. The cure extension was accounted for in the overall timeline, and the geometry between layers was correct, which was the only thing the cure time affected. The wait between layers was the part of the process I had never entirely worked out what to do with, not productively. Anyway, precision fabrication work in the active stages, the laying, the alignment, the geometry checks, requires a quality of attention that does not leave room for much else. But the wait stages are different. The material is doing what material does, and there is nothing to do but let it do that. And the kind of thinking that happens in those intervals is specific to them. You review the decisions you have made. You examine them from angles you did not have time for when you were making them. Occasionally you find one that looked correct at the time and looks less correct now. And if you find it early enough, you can still change it. I did not find any decisions that needed changing. The geometry was sound. The material behavior was within the predicted parameters at every stage. The design addressed the failure modes I had identified in 3 assessment sessions with measurements taken 3 times and averaged and verified a week later. There was nothing in the fabrication log that required revision. What I found myself thinking about instead, in the waiting intervals, was the case file. I had read it on the 3rd evening, while the midsection was in the curing fixture and I had 6 hours and nowhere specific to put them. The file for Myra. Case number and intake timestamp, and the fragmentary record of a collapse event assembled from whatever had survived the record-keeping failures that were common to all collapse events I had worked after. I had read it once, and then I had set it aside and gone back to the fabrication log. Because there is a point at which knowing more does not change what you are doing and changes other things instead. And I was in the middle of a fabrication sequence and did not want those other things interfering with the geometry decisions. But I had read it once, and the wait intervals brought it back. Vela Station collapse. Atmospheric event. 14 fatalities in the initial event. 62 critically injured. 308 displaced. The record for Myra. Age approximate 7. Left leg amputated below the knee following crush injury sustained during evacuation. Following crush injury sustained during evacuation. There is a specific kind of compression in that kind of notation. The words do the minimum required and no more. They tell you the outcome and the mechanism, and they give you the intake number. They do not tell you what evacuation looks like from the inside of a collapse event. They do not tell you what decisions get made in what order or what the corridor looked like, or whether it was fast or slow, or whether she understood what was happening, or how long it took before the pain became the information rather than the event itself. The notation contains all of that and none of it, the way resettlement records always do, which is how they stay manageable to the people who have to write them and read them, and process them across hundreds of cases. I had worked the Veldorn aftermath for 8 months. The Veldorn records had the same quality, the same compression. What had happened to hundreds of people in the Veldorn collapse fit into a notation format designed to be searchable and quantifiable and portable, which meant it fit into a format designed for things that notation is not actually equipped to carry. You work with that for 8 months and you understand that the notation is not the event and that the event is not recoverable from the notation. And that is the correct understanding to have because the alternative is something you cannot sustain across a caseload of any size. What I found in the wait intervals was that I was thinking about the 4 running steps, not about the notation, about the 4 steps themselves, the specific moment of the decision, the walk back to the railing and the quality of that walk. Deliberate and unhurried and very much a choice. A 7-year-old with a crush injury sustained during evacuation had arrived at Orvith with a socket that did not fit her, had been standing at the railing for weeks watching the other children run, and had made the calculation about what was and was not worth attempting with the equipment available to her. And the calculation was correct, and she had acted on it with a completeness that did not leave room for second guessing. I went back to the fabrication log and noted the start time of the 3rd layer. The distal cup and the 4 wall sections together accounted for the first 6 days of fabrication. The final shell came off the mandrel on the evening of the 6th day. I held it under the bench lamp and rotated it slowly, checking the geometry at each orientation against the assessment template. The distal cup sat correctly in its position. The wall thickness was within tolerance at all measurement points around the circumference. The proximal rim was the correct diameter and the correct height. I wrote in the fabrication log, within design parameters, no deviations, and set the shell in the safe storage cabinet. Then I mixed the surface tint. The standard Model 7 shell came in cream beige. It was a neutral choice, optimized for the widest range of skin tones in the compact's primary service populations. And cream beige was what you got unless you had a reason to specify otherwise. I had a reason. I had noted it in the fabrication log after the 2nd session. Surface tint, blue-gray, per patient preference. It was a straightforward notation. I had mixed blue-gray tints before for patients who wanted something specific. It was not complicated. What I had not written in the fabrication log was the particular shade I was mixing toward. I had the tinting agents arranged on the bench, and I worked through the proportions methodically, adding increments of each agent to the base, and checking the result under the bench lamp, against the assessment template, and then against something that was not the assessment template. The blue I was using had a particular quality, not purely blue, with enough gray in it to read as something you might find in a body, rather than in a manufactured object. I adjusted the ratio twice. When I was satisfied with the result, I applied it to the cured shell and set it to dry. I looked at the dried tint under the bench lamp and understood that I had been working toward the color of Saren's skin. I had not planned that consciously. I had noted blue-gray in the fabrication log because Myra had said blue-gray like her and I had written it down. But the particular shade I had mixed was not a generic blue-gray. It was specific in a way that I had not made a decision about, which meant I had made a decision about it without making a decision, which is a different kind of decision and not one I had a straightforward feeling about. I noted the tint specification in the fabrication log and moved on to the liner modification. The suspension liner modification took 2 more evenings. The standard pediatric liner was the correct length for Myra's residual limb, but the proximal diameter needed to be reduced and reformed to match the specific tissue compliance map from her assessment. I heat-formed the liner material over a custom mandrel I had turned from workshop stock, a process that required the mandrel to be brought to the correct temperature, the liner material positioned precisely over it, and the entire assembly cooled slowly and evenly to prevent distortion. Even cooling across the full circumference of the proximal rim was the part that required the most attention. Uneven cooling produced differential shrinkage, and differential shrinkage in the proximal rim produced exactly the kind of elevation variation that would create uneven suspension at the primary contact zone. The first attempt had an asymmetry in the proximal rim, 2 millimeters of elevation difference across the rim circumference, which would create uneven suspension at the critical contact zone. I measured it 3 times to confirm what I was seeing, and then I set the liner aside and machined a second mandrel with a corrected geometry on the high side. The second liner was correct. I measured it at 8 points around the proximal rim circumference, and it was within tolerance at all 8. I recorded the final liner specification in the fabrication log. I did not record the first liner as a failed attempt, because it was not a failed attempt. It was part of the process of arriving at a result that was within tolerance, and the result was what mattered for the fitting record. On day 9, I had the completed assembly on the fitting bench: the shell, the liner, the pylon, the foot unit, the suspension hardware. I looked at it for a moment under the bench lamp before I sent the message. It was what I had designed it to be. The geometry was correct. The tint was the specific blue-gray that I had not consciously planned. The liner sat inside the shell with the proximal rim at the correct height and the correct diameter, and the suspension hardware in the correct position. I sent the message. "Ready when you are," Saren replied within the hour. "We will be there at the 7th hour." I set the assembly in the storage cabinet and turned off the bench lamp and sat for a moment in the dark of the bay. The residential tier was quiet outside. Somewhere in the overnight cycle of the station, something mechanical ran its routine check and went quiet again. I had been at Orvith for 3 months, and I had fabricated 24 custom pediatric sockets in 12 years, and I had not previously sat in the dark of a fabrication bay for several minutes after completing one. I noted that fact without characterizing it, put on my jacket, and walked back to my quarters through the empty corridor. The following morning I arrived at Workshop Bay 4 before the 7th hour, and turned on the bench lamp and set out the fitting equipment in the order I would need it: liner application kit, socket alignment tools, load assessment stand, gate evaluation markers, the liner cleaning kit I had prepared as a maintenance reference. I checked the assembly one more time in the morning light. The geometry was the same as it had been the night before, which is the expected result and which I confirmed anyway, because confirmation costs nothing and the alternative is assuming. I heard them in the corridor before the door opened. Myra's footstep pattern, which I had been listening to from railing and corridor and workshop for 3 weeks now, was distinct. The particular cadence of a child compensating for a device that did not fit, the slight irregularity at push-off, the weight redistribution that had become habit. I had been listening to that pattern without naming the fact that I was listening to it. The door opened. Myra walked in first, and she went directly to the fitting bench, and she stopped when she saw the assembly. She looked at it without saying anything for a moment. Then she reached out with 2 fingers and touched the surface of the shell, lightly, in the way you touch something you have been waiting for, and which has arrived exactly as you imagined it, and which you are not quite certain yet is real. "That is mine," she said. "That is yours," I said. She looked up at her mother. Saren was standing in the bay doorway, looking at the assembly on the fitting bench, and whatever was in her expression was contained entirely behind the controlled surface. I could not read what was behind it from where I was standing. I was not sure I was meant to. "The fitting," I said, "would take approximately 40 minutes. We could begin whenever they were ready." Myra turned back to the bench. "Ready," she said. The fitting took 40 minutes. Liner application first. I showed Myra the rolling technique, which is the correct method for applying a suspension liner to a residual limb and which is not intuitive the first time you see it. The liner rolls over the limb from the distal end upward in a controlled, even motion, with the goal of excluding air at the interface as the liner seats. Air pockets at the interface create pressure variation under load, and pressure variation under load creates discomfort at specific points, which is the opposite of what the liner is designed to do. Myra watched the demonstration once with the complete attention she brought to everything. Then she tried it herself. The first attempt had a small air pocket at the mid-liner level, visible as a slight irregularity in the surface. She felt it before I said anything and looked up at me. "Try again," I said. She rolled the liner off and started from the distal end. The second attempt was clean. The liner seated evenly across the full contact surface with no visible irregularity. She looked at it for a moment, checking her own work. "That one is correct," I said. "I know," she said. Socket seating followed, aligning the socket correctly over the seated liner before applying full body weight, checking that the proximal rim was in the right position before load was introduced, because the time to find a misalignment is before load, not after. I walked Myra through the alignment markers and showed her how to verify the proximal rim contact zone visually before standing. She went through the sequence carefully, the way she went through everything, without rushing it, without pretending to understand what she had not yet verified for herself. Then she stood. Standing load assessment. I asked her to stand with her full weight on the prosthetic and describe what she felt. She was quiet for a moment. Her attention was directed inward, the specific quality of attention that happens when you are trying to describe a sensory experience accurately, rather than just confirming that someone wants to hear something positive. "It feels different," she said. "In what way?" "It feels like it is where it is supposed to be." That was a correct description of a correctly fitted socket, not a rehearsed answer, not the answer she thought I was looking for. The direct report of a 7-year-old who has decided that imprecise answers are not useful and that the accurate one is the only one worth giving. I made a note in the fitting log, gait evaluation. I asked her to walk the length of the workshop. She walked it, her attention moving between her feet and the forward path the way it does at the beginning of a new fit, when the body is still integrating the new information and has not yet decided to stop monitoring it. I asked her to walk back faster. She walked it faster. I asked her whether anything felt wrong, and she went through the same internal process as before, checking carefully before answering. "No," she said. "It does not slip. The proximal rim is in the correct position. There is no gap at the distal end for the limb to move into." She looked down at the socket, then up at me. "Can I run?" The workshop was not long enough for a meaningful running assessment. I had been thinking about this since the previous evening. "The corridor outside Bay 4, I said. "More room and a better surface. Let us use that." I opened the bay door. The corridor outside ran approximately 40 meters before it met the junction with the main residential access passage. It was empty at this hour, lit by the station's overhead panels. The flat even light of a working space rather than a living one. The floor was the standard composite decking used throughout the fabrication level, firm and even, the kind of surface a gait assessment should happen on. Myra walked out ahead of us. Saren came to stand beside me in the doorway. She had been in the bay for 40 minutes and had said almost nothing during the fitting process, which was the same quality of contained attention she had brought to the measurement sessions, present and complete and not requiring any of the space. Myra walked the corridor once, slowly, watching her feet, watching the socket, integrating. Then she walked it again at a faster pace, her attention still moving between the floor ahead and the prosthetic. At the far end of the corridor, she stopped and turned and looked back at us. I had seen this moment in 23 previous fittings. The pause at the far end, the look back, What lives in that pause is not simple, even for a 7-year-old, because the body has memory, and the memory is of what happened the last time it tried this. And the last time it tried this, it failed at the 4th step. The body does not immediately believe that this time will be different. It has to run the test. She ran, tentatively at first. The way you run when you are waiting for the failure to arrive. Short, controlled strides. Her weight forward. Her attention on the prosthetic. 3 strides. 5. The socket did not slip. The proximal rim held its contact zone. The load transferred through the pylon at the correct angle and the correct rate, and produced the correct forward motion without the compensatory weight shift, without the instability, without the 4-step limit she had been living inside for months. At some point between 5 strides and 10, she stopped running tentatively. And then she was simply running. The heel strike cadence changed first. In the tentative strides it had been careful, each foot placement deliberate, the body still negotiating with the new geometry. As the negotiation resolved, the cadence evened out, the stride length extended. The compensatory weight shift that had become habit over months of managing the ill-fitting socket. The small lateral lean she made at push-off to redistribute load away from the rim contact point began to dissolve. Not immediately. These things do not dissolve immediately in children any more than they do in adults, but I could see it beginning to go. The pattern releasing its hold 1 stride at a time. The body recalibrating toward the gait it would have had if the socket had always fit. I have fitted 24 custom pediatric sockets over 12 years, including this one. And there is a moment in a successful fitting that is the goal of every measurement session and every fabrication decision and every hour in the waiting intervals between cure cycles. The moment when the device stops being a thing the wearer is monitoring and becomes part of the body. The way functional things become part of the body when they work correctly. The moment when the wearer stops watching the prosthetic and looks up at where they are going. It happened at approximately the 20-meter mark. She stopped watching her leg. She looked up. She ran the remaining 20 meters to the end of the corridor, turned without slowing significantly, and ran back. She ran to me, not to her mother, who was standing in the doorway beside me, which I might have expected. To me, which I had not expected and which I did not have time to prepare for, because children who are running do not give you time to prepare for anything. She had her arms around my neck and her face against mine, and she pressed her cheek against my cheek and held on. "It works," she said. Her voice had the compressed quality of a child who has something important to say and is saying it directly into the space available. "Yes," I said. "It does." I put one hand on her back and held on for a moment. She was 7 years old, or near enough, and she had been standing at the railing watching other children run for weeks, with the particular stillness of a child who has made a correct calculation about the limits of available equipment. She had asked me if I could fix it with the directness of someone who had already decided the answer was yes, and the socket fit correctly, and she had just run 40 meters and come back, and I found, for a moment, that I could not locate anything that seemed more important than those particular facts at this particular time. She let go and stepped back. The large dark eyes looked at me, then moved past me to the doorway. I turned to look at Sarian. I had been at 2 collapse event postings before Orvith. I had conducted 24 custom pediatric fittings in 12 years. I had been in corridors after successful fittings when parents were present, and I had seen a range of responses: satisfaction, relief, a kind of delayed grief that sometimes arrived at the end of a long wait for the correct solution, or a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the problem was resolved and they would like to know about maintenance requirements. I was not prepared for Saren. The controlled stillness was there. I do not think it could have not been there. It was structural by that point, built through 4 months in a resettlement system after a collapse event that had taken most of what she had organized her life around. And structural things do not dismantle in a corridor at the 7th hour because something has gone well. The composure held. But inside it, barely held by it, was something that had no controlled quality at all. Her amber eyes were wet, not running over. She was not going to let them run over. And that refusal was as structural as the composure itself, but wet and very bright and fixed on her daughter, who had already turned away and was walking back down the corridor, watching her own gait with the systematic attention of someone running a methodical evaluation. Saren looked at me. The thing that passed between us in that moment was not gratitude. Exactly, gratitude was part of it. But gratitude has a direction. It moves from one person toward another. And what I was looking at was not directional. It was mutual, Two people on both sides of something that had just happened. The person who had built the socket and the person who had watched her daughter stand at the railing for weeks and had refused 3 inadequate solutions without explanation because she understood exactly what she was refusing. Recognizing, together, what the thing was that had just happened in this corridor. She put her hand on my forearm. A brief, deliberate contact, with the specific pressure of meaning it. Then she took her hand away. "What do I need to do for maintenance?" she said. She said it in the flattest, most practical register she had available. And I understood exactly what she was doing. She was offering both of us a way back into a mode of engagement that we knew how to be in. And I took the offer because it was the right thing to take. "Daily cleaning of the liner with the kit I will give you," I said. "I will walk you through the process before you leave. Weekly inspection of the suspension system at the proximal rim for early wear. The socket geometry will hold for approximately 18 months before Myra's growth requires a refitting. I will be here for that appointment." She was quiet for a moment. "You will be here in 18 months, she said. Not quite a question. "I filed a posting extension 3 weeks ago," I said. "Another year at Orvith." She looked at me. The controlled surface held. But what the composure was containing shifted in some way that I was not yet practiced enough at reading to name. The way something shifts when it has been holding a fixed position for a long time and is carefully beginning to consider that a fixed position is a choice rather than a requirement. "No," she said. "It is not." She was not looking at me. She was looking at Myra, who had reached the far end of the corridor and was turning for another pass, her gait settling into something more natural with every stride as the nervous system began integrating the new contact geometry. In the corridor, the sound of one child running, and then Myra noticed Saren making a small movement, and she peeled away from the middle of the corridor and came back toward us, her stride slowing as she covered the last few meters. She stopped between us and looked from Saren's face to my face with the large attentive eyes, doing the reading that children do when they understand that something has happened between adults and want to know what it was. "I want to go to the yard," she said. "Tomorrow," Saren said. "Tonight," Myra said. "Tomorrow," Saren said. "You need to rest the socket interface for 12 hours before extended use." This was not medically required. A correctly fitted socket has no clinical requirement for a 12-hour rest period before extended use. I did not say this. Myra looked at me. "Is that right?" she said. "Your mother knows what is best," I said. She considered this with the expression of someone filing a response under diplomatic rather than accurate. "Tomorrow," she said, and took her mother's hand. They walked to the corridor junction. Serene did not look back. Myra looked back once, over her shoulder, the large dark eyes doing a final assessment and arriving at a conclusion she did not share. Then they rounded the junction and were gone. I went back into workshop bay 4 and sat on the fabrication stool with the liner cleaning kit on the bench in front of me. I had prepared it to give to Saren and had forgotten to do it. I would drop it at the residential tier intake desk in the morning with a message asking her to collect it. The workshop was quiet in the way it is quiet after something has been finished in it. Not empty quiet. The quiet of a space that has done what it was built to do and is resting in that fact. The bench lamp was on. The fitting log was open. I had written the final entries. Socket seated correctly. Gate assessment within expected parameters for first fit. Proximal rim contact confirmed at correct zone. No pistoning observed at running assessment speed. Wearer report. No discomfort. No instability. I thought about the things that bring you to a posting. You come with a credential and a list of approved work and a general intention to be useful, which is a sufficient reason and an honest one. And then one morning you walk past a yard and there is a child at the railing. And something in you looks at an 8mm gap and decides that 6 to 8 weeks is not acceptable. You make the socket in 9 days in your own time. You mix the surface tint toward a color you did not consciously intend. The child runs 40 meters and comes back and puts her arms around your neck and her face against yours. And behind her, the mother who has been holding everything together for 4 months looks at you with wet amber eyes and puts her hand on your arm and says, when you tell her the work here is not finished, no, it is not. You file a posting extension without being certain why. And then the reason walks down a corridor and stops watching its leg at the 20-meter mark. And then you understand why. I closed the fitting log. I sat for a while longer in the quiet of the bay, with the liner cleaning kit on the bench and the overhead panels cycling toward the evening setting. And I thought about 2 words. No, it isn't. Outside, somewhere on the residential tier, The station was moving through the last of its afternoon routines, and I had another year, and the work here was not finished, and those two things were enough to go on with. The morning after the fitting, I carried the liner cleaning kit to the residential tier intake desk and sent a message to Saren asking her to collect it at her convenience. I told her there was no urgency. She replied within 20 minutes that she would come to Workshop Bay 4 that afternoon. She came at the 5th hour. She came alone. Myra, she said when she arrived, was at the reading program on the upper residential tier, a session that ran most of the afternoon on alternating days, which Myra attended because she found the other children there less interested in running than the children in the yard and therefore easier to be patient with. Saren said this without any particular expression, in the tone she used for factual statements. And I thought about Myra's assessment of the reading program children and decided it was probably accurate. I gave Saren the cleaning kit and walked her through the process. Daily cleaning of the liner involved removing the liner from the socket, turning it inside out, cleaning the interior surface with the solution and applicator in the kit, allowing it to air dry fully before reapplication. The proximal rim required particular attention during cleaning because it was the zone with the most consistent contact and therefore the most consistent exposure to skin oils and moisture. And contamination at the rim affected both the liner's structural integrity over time and the quality of the contact interface. Saren listened and asked 2 questions. Both were precise. The first was about the drying time required before reapplication, and whether that time changed in conditions of lower ambient humidity. I told her the drying time on the station was typically sufficient with the standard cycle, but that she should allow an additional 10 minutes on days when the environmental controls were running the lower humidity setting, which happened occasionally during the deep winter quarter cycle. The second question was about whether the cleaning solution had any interaction with the silicone matrix that would accelerate degradation over the 18-month timeline. I told her it did not, that the solution was formulated specifically for silicone liner materials, and that the weekly compliance inspection would catch any degradation signs well before they affected fit. She nodded. Then she was quiet, and I was quiet, and the workshop had the quality it sometimes had in the middle of the day, when the fabrication work was between stages and the space was just a space. "The yard tomorrow morning," she said. "We will be there at the first hour. I will look at her gate from the railing," I said. "I want to see the load transfer pattern at running speed after a full night in the socket. It should be correct, but I want to see the pattern before I confirm it." She told Myra not to sleep in it. "I know," Saren said, with the flat precision of someone confirming a prediction. "She will learn," I said. "I know." We were quiet again. The workshop held its 5th-hour quality around us. "The geometry lesson," Saren said. "You offered to teach me to read the socket geometry." I had mentioned it during the maintenance instructions the day before, briefly, as part of the explanation of what the 18-month refitting would involve. I had not been certain she had marked it as something to return to. "I did," I said. "I want to begin before the refitting. I want to understand the assessment well enough to conduct an initial evaluation myself, so that I can identify significant changes in the fit before the scheduled appointment if they occur." I looked at her. The amber eyes were steady and direct. She was not asking permission, or describing a desire in the hope that it would be accommodated. She was stating something she had decided she wanted and stating it in the terms in which she had decided it. "I can teach you that," I said. "I know you can," she said. She picked up the cleaning kit. She left. I sat back down at the fabrication bench and found that I was thinking about the 18-month refitting schedule and the geometry lessons between now and then, and about the quality of attention that I had seen in 2 people over the course of 3 weeks. The way Myra had listened to the socket explanation in the first measurement session, identifying the gaps in her understanding and filling them with the next question. The way Serene had read the fabrication log in the second session, working through the load pathway sketch on her own and confirming the failure mode before I guided her to it. 2 people who learned by building the understanding themselves rather than receiving it. One of them 7 years old and one of them a grade 4 station authority officer who was currently a displaced person in a resettlement yard on Station Orvith, and both of them approaching new information with the same quality of methodical, complete attention. The geometry lessons would not be short. I found that I did not mind this. In the morning, I went to the yard at the first hour. Saren was already there. She was standing at her usual position at the far end of the railing with her weight evenly distributed and her hands resting on the rail. and she had arrived before me, which I should have expected given that she had told me the first hour, and I had arrived at the first hour, and she was the kind of person who does not tell you a time and then arrive after it. When I reached the railing, she moved sideways without looking at me, just a small shift to make room. The way you make room for someone whose presence at the railing is expected. I stood beside her. We looked at the yard. Myra was already in it. She was not running circuits. She was running a short distance back and forth across the open space, the same 10 meters or so, with the specific focused attention of someone conducting a systematic evaluation. Not playing, testing. She would run the distance. Stop. Stand for a moment with her attention turned inward, and then run it again. The same controlled, methodical quality she had brought to the liner application, to the gait assessment questions, to everything. She is checking her own work, Saren said. Yes. The heel strike cadence this morning was different from what I had observed in the corridor the day before. More confident already. The body integrating the correct contact geometry faster than I had projected. Residual limb gait recalibration in children tends to be faster than in adults, partly because of the neurological plasticity of a developing system, and partly because children are less committed to the compensatory patterns they have built. Adults build compensation into habit over years, and habit is resistant. Children build it over months. And when the condition that required it resolves, the compensation dissolves more readily. The body simply notices that the old pattern is no longer necessary and begins revising without announcing the revision. What I was watching in the yard was the revision happening in real time. 12 hours in the socket, Saren said. I can already see the difference in her gait. The pattern is not the same as yesterday. The compensation is releasing, I said. She will stabilize into the natural gait pattern by the end of the week, probably sooner. Children recalibrate faster than adults. She does not know she is doing it. No, the nervous system does the work without consulting the person. Saren watched. A group of children appeared from the far corridor. 6 or 7 of them, the first of the morning circuit runner arriving at the yard, with the habitual energy of kids who have been doing this long enough that the circuits are simply what mornings are. They spread out along the perimeter and began to run, and Myra, who had been running her test distances in the center of the yard, saw them and stopped. She stood in the open space for a moment. Not the stopped before the railing stillness I had watched for weeks. Different. The stillness of a child deciding whether to join something rather than the stillness of a child who has decided they cannot. She joined the edge of the group, tentatively at first, matching their pace rather than setting her own, watching the ground briefly before she stopped watching the ground, then less tentatively. Then she was simply running with them, one child among 6 or 7 children, in the low flat light of the station's winter quarter, not standing at the railing. I did not say anything. Saren did not say anything. We stood at the railing together and watched her daughter run, and the corridor had the sound of children running in it, and there was nothing to say about it that would have made it more than it was, which was already everything it needed to be. She ran 14 circuits this morning before you arrived, Saren said, after a while. Her voice had its usual even quality, the register of someone relaying a factual observation. I thought about that. How many did the fastest child run? Seville ran 12. A pause. Myra counted. Myra counted. Saren said it with the particular tone of someone who is not surprised. I thought about the arithmetic of that. A child who had been standing at the railing for weeks, watching the circuit runners from the outside, had arrived at the yard at the first hour, run 14 circuits before most of them got there, and counted. I did not know Seville. I did not need to. Does Seville know she is being counted? I said. Myra will tell her, Saren said. She tells people things they need to know. We watched the circuits for a while longer. The group had grown as more children arrived from the corridor, and Myra had moved from the edge of the group toward the middle of it, which was a different position than the edge and required a different kind of presence. She was managing it. The light shifted in the way it shifted in winter quarter, finding new angles through the observation panels as the station's rotation carried them into the longer morning stretch. And the yard had the quality of a place where ordinary things were being done by ordinary people, which was the best thing a resettlement yard could be. The geometry lesson, I said. We could begin this week if you want. 5th hour works for me. 5th hour, Saren said, after the yard. I will bring the assessment diagrams and the fabrication log. She nodded once. Her attention was still on the yard, on the circuit runners, on Myra in the middle of the group, running a pace that was not the fastest pace in the group, but was a pace that belonged to someone who was running because running was the thing to do, and not because they were checking anything anymore. A circuit brought Myra's group near the railing. She spotted us, and her face did the thing that the faces of 7-year-olds do when they have something to show, and the people they most want to show it to are right there. A full, unreserved grin. The kind that does not leave room for anything else. She lifted a hand briefly in our direction without breaking stride. The acknowledgement of someone who cannot stop, because stopping would interrupt the running, and the running was the point. And she kept running. We watched her go. Saren's hands were on the railing, and mine were on the railing. And the circuit continued. And the group came back around on the next pass, and Myra was still in the middle of it. Still running. The gait pattern settling with every circuit into something that looked less like recalibration and more like just the way she ran. After a while, another circuit brought the group close to the railing again, and this time Myra slowed and peeled away from the group entirely and came to the rail, catching the top bar with both hands, breathing harder now. The particular breathing of someone who has been running properly for a while. "I have to go," she said. She looked at Saren. "In a while," Saren said. "Finish your circuits." Myra looked at me with the large, direct eyes. "Is her gait good?" she said, the technical phrasing. Precise, the same register she used when she asked whether she could run the day before. Not is she running well. Is her gait good? "It is very good," I said. "It will be better by the end of the week." "I know," she said. And she pushed off the railing and ran back into the yard and rejoined her group without breaking the circuit, slotting back in where she had left it with the confidence of someone who knows she is welcome in the space she has entered. Saren watched her go. Something in her expression, not the controlled composure, which was always there and always would be, but what lived inside the composure, had a quality I was beginning to be able to read. Not name yet, not quite. But I could recognize it the way you begin to recognize a word in a language you are still learning, knowing what it means before you can say it. "Thank you," she said. She said it to Myra's back. To the yard. To the group of children running their circuits in the winter quarter light. "You already thanked me," I said. "I know," she said. "I am thanking you again." I did not say anything to that. There are things that do not require a response and that are not improved by one. And this was that kind of thing. And she knew it, and I knew it. And we stood at the railing for a while, longer in the winter quarter light, watching the children run their circuits. Myra ran 3 more circuits before the group dissolved into the morning's other activities. On the last one, she did not look at the railing at all, just ran the full perimeter with the particular absorbed quality of someone who is not performing the thing they are doing, but simply doing it. The compensation patterns from the old socket were almost entirely gone. By the end of the week, they would be. By the month after that, I did not think she would remember having had them. The way children do not remember the physical negotiation of early adaptation once the adaptation is complete. The nervous system files it somewhere that ordinary memory does not reach, and the body simply moves the way the body moves, without the record of what it cost to get there, which is, I had come to think, one of the more useful things bodies know how to do. The yard emptied by degrees as the morning cycle progressed. Children peeling off for meals and reading programs, and the other structures that organized a resettlement tier's days. The yard was a good place when it was full, and it was a good place when it was empty. And knowing both qualities of it was something that took a few months to understand. Myra went with a group heading toward the far corridor, turning once to find us at the railing and giving a small wave that was simultaneously a greeting and a departure. The dual-purpose efficiency of a child who has things to do. Saren watched her until she was gone. Then she straightened her hands on the railing and looked at the empty yard and said nothing for a moment in the way of someone completing a thought they have been working on. "5th hour," she said, after the yard. She lifted her hands from the railing and tucked them into the front pockets of her jacket and turned from the railing and walked toward the corridor that led back to the residential quarters. "5th hour," I said, after her. After the yard. She did not look back. Her footsteps on the corridor floor were even and unhurried and already fading by the time I turned back to the railing and stood with my hands on it and looked at the yard in the winter quarter light. The yard was quiet now. Empty in the way it was only quiet for the short period between the morning activity and the midday meal cycle, when the children were elsewhere and the space had its own quality. The particular stillness of a place built for movement and resting between uses. The observation panels were doing what they did at this hour. finding the angle that made the light come in flat and even and a little gold. The work here was not finished. I had another year. Somewhere on the residential tier, the midday cycle was beginning its early preparations. The faint sound of logistics and routines, and the ordinary structure of days that go on being days regardless of what happens in them. I had geometry lessons to prepare for. I had an 18-month refitting to plan toward. I had a posting extension filed and confirmed, and a workshop bay with equipment that needed maintaining, and a clinic that needed support, and a fabrication log with one completed entry and many more to come. The work here was not finished. And I had another year, and we had time to figure out the rest. That was enough. It had always been enough, if you were willing to start with it. I took my hands off the railing and walked back toward Workshop Bay 4, and behind me the yard waited for the afternoon, when the children would come back and fill it again with the sound of running.